Welcome back, everyone. Last week, French President Emmanuel Macron caused quite the stir after an interview with Politico related to his visit to China. We're taking a closer look at the topic together with Professor Kalypso Nicolaidis, who is the Chair of Global Affairs here at the UI School of Transnational Governance. Kalypso, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Roland.
Great to have you in the studio. And according to Macron, Europe should reduce its dependency on the United States. So let's start there. What do you make of his comments?
Well, indeed, what did Macron say? We must resist the pressure to become American followers and to get involved in a crisis not of our own between the big guys, US and China. And at some level, as a European or a citizen, you can only but agree with a vision of the world. First of all, that is Macron's great commitment since he became president, which is to try to promote and strengthen a strategic Europe, a Europe that has its own voice in the world, and a Europe that really resists what we can call the great bifurcation, a world where we'll have sphere of influence US, sphere of influence China, including in the virtual world, and we will have to choose and break our ties with China. Do we want that? No. And most Europeans will agree with the idea that you don't follow blindly anyone. And you don't have to be a de Gaulle fan to believe that. Especially at a time when, well, of course, US is a superpower, so it makes these unilateral decisions. Its great inflation act is wonderful for the green economy, but it really hurts some European companies without even consulting with Europe. So, at first you say, yes, you don't have to be French like me to believe that this is a good idea. But the problem is with Macron that even the French analysts of foreign policies don't always understand why he says something that makes sense for Europe, but then adds a word that, as one commentator said, it's all very nice to speak, but when you speak, you must only tell the truth, and the truth should not always be said. Now, whether it's true or not, he did make some additional comment that seemed to be saying, well, we might not follow the US on China as relation and a threat to Taiwan. We don't want to be caught in that spiral. Now, there are three problems. With the commentators, the critiques of Macron. Three types of problem. Is it fair or not? Not clear. But first, the paradox is that, Macron went to China with Ursula von der Leyen to assert a European voice. And instead, what did he do? He divided Europeans because most of the member states worry about the bargain with the US. The US is the strongest and more forceful supporter of Ukraine. Now, we are there, but without the US, Ukraine would be lost. And in exchange, at least it is thought, we will support the US stance in Taiwan because it's consistent. If Russia can't invade its neighbor, Ukraine, well, why could Taiwan threaten and potentially invade, could China, oops, it would be the world in risk, Taiwan. So there is the sense that there is this bargain. Now, you could say, well, the US is in Ukraine not to serve us Europeans, but it's because it's in its interest. But nevertheless, the other Europeans believe that Macron is kind of implicitly breaking this bargain. That's the first criticism. The second is the attribution of responsibility in this whole story. Macron seems to, at least in the eyes of his critiques, inverse causality in saying, well, the US is provoking China. It's doing, high-level politicians go to China. They provoke China in its sphere of influence. And critiques say, actually, it's China who's threatening Taiwan with military maneuvers. So there's this debate and a sense that Macron is not on the right side of the coin here. But perhaps most importantly for all of us in this world is how you de-escalate a situation, not just in Ukraine these days, but around Taiwan, in a world where actually they will argue, look, France is a player. France is, the only European nuclear power in the Security Council. France would not benefit from a war around Taiwan, economically, militarily. France should have a voice there, but an appeasing voice. Now, Macron tells us, I was appeasing. I even got Xi Jinping to say, this is not my war about Ukraine, and to position himself and China as a neutral power. That's his interpretation. The problem is that what Macron, I think, really wanted to say, and he said it later in Denmark, is that we need to preserve the status quo. And do his remark really serve the status quo? He wanted to say we need to preserve a peaceful solution, but he didn't quite say that initially. And the question is, when you seem to be wavering on your own transatlantic alliance, do you really serve that equilibrium? Because it's a very fragile equilibrium. And I think that's why the rest of the world, at least those who don't just attacking aggressively, but still ask, what should you say to de-escalate in this world and keep a peaceful resolution of conflict?
Yeah. I think that shows quite clearly why people took such a great interest in this story as it happened last week. And in fact, maybe to continue, there are a lot of Europeans who would like to consider the European Union as a superpower in its own right. Now, that can of course be discussed to what extent it actually is, but it is a fact that EU strategic autonomy, and I cite the ability to defend Europe and act militarily in its neighborhood, that strategic autonomy is an objective of the von der Leyen Commission. Now, to what extent is that objective informed by Macron's views and his leadership, and how far has the EU come so far?
Yes, Roland, this term strategic autonomy is one of these, in academic jargon, we say empty signifier. What does it really mean? And you could say, well, yes, it's a French obsession. The economists think of Europe going French. France has always, since the end of World War II, tried to say, especially with de Gaulle, we are autonomous, we are ourselves, and wanted Europe to be the same. But what's happened is that actually this has become a question, a mindset, a strategic ambition for Europe as a whole in Europe's own language. And why do I say this? Let's think of it as there's been kind of three phases around this idea of strategic autonomy. The first phase is actually almost as old as the European Union, as old as all these debates, around NATO and a European pillar of NATO, and the Brits being unhappy with it, and other Europeans saying, no, we need to have our own strategy. It's an old story. And in fact, when the European Action Service was created in the years 2000, there was a lot of talk about how Europe should define its interests through its strategic vision or strategic compass later. So this is an old story that comes from the military realm. But then in a second phase, Europe in the early 2012, 13, and during the financial crisis and trying to come out of the financial crisis, and with the relationship with China starting to disunite Europeans, this becomes a geo-economic story. And by 2017-18, Europe starts to say, we need to stop being naive now vis-à-vis China and not be so dependent economically. And this is when we have this phase of a defensive strategic autonomy, where Europe starts to screen foreign investments, especially from China, and say, maybe they should invest in strategic parts of our, making chips or making in sectors that are themselves where we can't be dependent. Later we have COVID and it becomes, the health dimension. But this, little by little, at the European level, becomes some kind of industrial policy. And strategic autonomy becomes the idea, maybe not the old industrial policy that we need to pick winners and losers, but that through the EU, say the Recovery Fund, or through maybe even strategic outward investment and screening them, we should actually be looking for an industrial and economic base in Europe that is not so dependent on the outside. Now, this starts looking a bit like the US, but where it starts being more like the US is when we have this third phase where it's no longer, it's not, is it going to be an open strategic autonomy, the really kind of a big discussion of what this really means today. And this is where we are now, where indeed all out, much more offensive, screening outward investment so that countries like China and Russia and perhaps others will not, we will not help them be number one in sectors that matter to us. Coming back to military issues, but there is big issues that that Europeans are still very hesitant about. And one of them that I think we need to put on the table is what we kind of refer to as weaponized interdependence. The way in which the US, around the Ukraine war and the fallout from that, has actually used its control to start with of financial networks to turn on and off the access of countries to this interdependent world and say, no, this is our control and we will, not grant you access to SWIFT or platforms in the digital realm. And there Europe says, well, interdependence, commerce, connections, globalization of a certain kind is something we care about. And we're not sure we really want to follow the US in controlling the kind of interdependence that the rest of the world has. So there are questions around strategic autonomy, also digital strategic autonomy. What does this really mean? When, yes, we may try to attract the data of the world, but we don't have the GAFAs. Yeah. So what does it mean to be strategic autonomous in this digital world of ours?
Yeah. Well, Kalypso, I think that also leads us to the question, how others look at the EU's quest for strategic autonomy. In China, Xi Jinping must be quite satisfied with Macron's comments, as, of course, a weakened transatlantic partnership might be interesting for China. In Washington, maybe the reactions were less enthusiastic. How should the EU navigate this role as the third superpower in being, in development, and how do you think China and the US will react to this?
Yes, it's not so surprising that China would applaud both the overall strategic autonomy if it's directed vis-à-vis the US, but I think it might misunderstand how Europe as a whole, and including Macron, thinks of strategic autonomy. And above all, because whatever is being said about Macron's, neo-Gaullist vibes, I don't think he means equal distance, equidistance between the US and China. Macron understands very well what it means to be loyal to your alliances, including military alliances. And indeed, in a world where the word values is a big overused term, but we will be, and Europe and France will be vigilant in where China is going on values of democracy, cyber control of its citizens, human rights. Yes, of course, when it's mercantilist, when it wants to sell products to China or goes with all its firms that want to invest again in a post-COVID world in China, it cares about sometimes not proclaiming too much some of this, but nevertheless, structurally and in the long run, there is, I think, in my mind, no real issue about equidistance, especially when we think about values. So that would be the first point. Secondly, the question arises, though, Roland, whether Europe can really invent what it means to be an actor in planetary politics. And here I resist a bit your term of kind of a third power, third superpower. Some in Europe use this term. The French tend to still talk about Europe puissance. But we live in a world where the message we are hearing from the global South is that, we need to act on shared leadership, on shared design of norms and shared design of multilateralism. Europe is not about being a new or a reinvented superpower, but rather an actor that promotes inclusive and fair multilateralism with the rest of the world, with the developing world. And that calls for, yes, an ambition, but also a certain humility. It calls for maybe learning to decenter our Eurocentric approach that is inherited, from good old colonial DNA. We're not a neo-colonial, but are we a post-colonial power? A power that really understands the perceptions of the rest of the world when we reproduce this sense of, we're going to tell you what to do. Are we capable, instead of reversing the gaze, of learning from them about their democratic innovations, etc.? I believe in citizen power Europe, but also citizen power Latin America or Africa. Can we learn from each other in what we can gain from collective intelligence? And the point here, and this is kind of the third biggest point, Roland, is that, in planetary politics, the great challenge is how we as Europeans will contribute to thinking long term, to get all of the actors in the multilateral setting, to think long term, while our constraints in the short term are so important. And this means really that we need to help engineer, as the West, and Europe is the biggest economic power in the West in terms of population and trade, a bargain that respects the fact that the global South in the post-colonial era has been on the bad end of the stick. We've continued to grow. We've continued to benefit from global structures of capitalism, although very unequally distributed in our countries. But the global South is still asking for a fairer bargain, for not always shouldering the burden of adjustment, be it in green economy, where still it's the producers of goods that have to adjust rather than us, often the consumers. And we could go on and on about how we should redefine this economic bargain to a great extent. Because frankly, what we're seeing with the global order is that it's neither going to completely be redefined by a new order led by China, but nor can we have the luxury of maintaining the status quo. So if we're going to transform this order, change the order itself, rather than throwing it out the window, we need to do it on the basis of a new understanding with the Global South. And we shouldn't say Global South, but the many different poles and centers, multi-centered, polycentric world, very fluid, where if, countries in the Global South are strategically hedging between Europe, China, Russia, the US, well, that's par for the course. We need to live with that and become attractive again, so that when they do strategic hedging, it's often with us, rather than autocratic regimes with whom we don't want to share many of the values that they import on their citizens.
Thank you, Kalypso. You have actually opened a whole new discussion, and something that we might follow up on in another episode. I take your message that the EU is finding its role, but that role it's going to play on the global scene is definitely not one like the traditional superpowers as we used to know them. We have unboxed the consequences or the fallout after Macron's comments and in his visits to China, what the EU is trying to do in the area of strategic autonomy and the challenges it will face, how others look at it, and I think the role of Europe and the European Union in a multipolar world is an interesting topic for conversation another time in the studio. If you wish to come back, we would be very happy to have you.
Absolutely. I'm always very happy to discuss these issues and with you and also our students here at the School of Transnational Governance, ongoing topics.
Thanks a lot again, Kalypso, and thank you all for joining us. We see each other next week.